So how does the action invoker decide which controller method to execute for a given request? The answer to this question might seem obvious at first. It just picks the method with the same name as the action parameter from our route data, right? Well, in a sense, yes, but there's more to it than that. If you've worked with MVC, you're probably familiar with action selector attributes. These can be attached to controller methods to manipulate when they're chosen. However, there are actually several layers to the action method selection process. Let's make sure we fully understand the logical steps that the action invoker uses to choose one of these methods. First off, what qualifies a controller method to be a candidate for the action invoker? Well, the method signature itself is important. Only public, non-static, non-special methods can be considered. Special methods that are excluded from the list are items such as constructors or certain inherited methods like .toString and things like that. So first, the action invoker gets a list of methods that meet this criteria. If there are no methods that are valid candidates, an error is thrown because there is no action method to handle the request. If there's only one candidate, that method gets chosen by default. Where things get interesting is if there are multiple qualified methods to handle a request. If this is the case, the action invoker checks if any of the methods have action selectors associated with them. If any do, it evaluates the selectors and disqualifies any methods where one of the selectors returns false. Now the action invoker has to make a decision based on the remaining candidates. If there are no matches left, it throws an error again. If only one is left, that method gets selected. Now you might also have a scenario where there is a valid method with a selector that returns true and a valid method with no action selector. If this is the case, the method with the action selector gets chosen over the one without. If multiple methods have action selectors that all return true, this again creates an error because the methods are ambiguous. Now, this chart is not necessarily a one-to-one comparison with the programmatic decision-making of the action invoker. However, it does illustrate the general logic involved. The important takeaway is that there is more to this process than just finding a method with a matching name. Probably the most common scenario that you would use action selectors is to differentiate between a get and post version of the same method. For example, you might have a method called register. One version of this method is designed to return a view with a form to fill out. Another method with the same name is designed to handle the posted form and accepts a parameter for all of the posted data. Without additional information, the action invoker cannot decide between them for a given request. A common solution is to decorate each with an appropriate HTTP verb attribute such as HTTP get and post. Now it might sound trivial to choose one action method over another in the scope of the overall request lifecycle. However, remember that different action methods might return different action results. If an action selector attribute changes the method from one that returns a view to one that just returns some JSON, your code just removed the entire view engine rendering process from the current request lifecycle. Now from a day-to-day development perspective, this really isn't a big deal. We return different results from different methods all the time. However, it can be a big deal in the sense of how it affects the processing pipeline behind the scenes. But really, the important point here is just that understanding the impact of your code in MVC allows you to make better and more informed decisions as a developer. Action selectors are yet another part of MVC that's open to extension. You can implement your own selectors by creating a class that inherits from the Action Method Selector attribute class. You can then override a method called isValidForRequest, which simply returns a Boolean result. Remember, if any of the selectors for a method return false, it's no longer a candidate for selection by the action invoker. Your logic in these selectors can thus have a big impact on which action method is selected. Let's look at some examples of how action method selectors interact with the lifecycle in the next lesson.